I just want to thank Lucas and Esteban for this opportunity. I think it's wonderful that we are sharing in such depth. We face a very big problem of inequity in South Africa, and as a result of that, we've seen a coalition of over 190 NGOs trying to monitor what's happening in our country during this virus. And alongside that, we have a government that has really tried to pull together, communicate with people, and try and do its level best during this problem. I teach in a country where our term starts in January and ends at the beginning of December. So this virus hit us quite soon in the school year, and we now are in the 19th day of our lockdown, where schools have been closed and nobody is allowed out of their homes except to go and get medicine and food. In our school, which is an independent school, we were able to send our children home with devices. Kids that were on bursaries got an iPad and some data. But the majority of children in South Africa do not have access to data or to electronic devices. So it is very difficult to look at our country with one lens. The government, the Department of Education, of Basic Education, has done a lot using radio, television, Siavula, which is an online education resource provider. Publishers have come on board with free access to information. But as long as you've got data or a device, that's fine. But it's the lack of data and the lack of devices that are really going to leave so many children behind. In 2015, the Supreme Court ordered that every child should have a textbook of their own for every subject. And that still has not happened. So there are many schools where children are sharing textbooks. That's not all schools, but where textbooks were shared, obviously children are not all allowed to be sent home with the textbook, even though the Department of Education sent them home with a workbook and with a sort of timetable, a schedule of what should happen. So on the issue of textbooks, it becomes imperative that the department should ensure with these goodwill publishers or photocopying that children have access to printed information, particularly those that don't have access to data. But at the same time, we have a terrible level of illiteracy in our country. The PIL survey in 2016 showed that 78% of learners from grade 4 do not understand what they're reading. So verbal education becomes very important on radio and television and not just the printed word. And there's a lot of attempts by the department. They are using WhatsApp groups for the 25,000 primary school teachers who've been part of a government initiative of a primary school reading program, texting teachers with attached resources on WhatsApp. So the equity in resources is sadly lacking. The department has also got a curriculum recovery plan, which will involve when children do go back to school at the end of April, that they will have fewer school holidays, they will have extended hours of school, and that the curriculum will be shaved into the more core components of each year group, and that assessments will go ahead, but assessments will also be restructured according to what work is covered. In terms of all this, it sounds fantastic, and in one part of the curriculum recovery plan, there is a need to offer psychosocial support. But for me, that's really where we keep talking about how teachers need to also be trained in offering psychosocial support to students. But we know that teachers themselves are also fairly traumatized by this situation in some countries where death rates are rising. Last night, we heard that our virus will probably peak in September and that the death rates will grow exponentially between now and then. And I'm very reminded of Armando in Italy, where he was saying, to begin with, they had online lessons in a particular school. Then the lessons tapered off because they realized that full-on lessons with online, with following the full content of curriculum was too stressful, so they toned down. But then lastly, they had to offer a lot more psychosocial support because of the increasing death rate in their community. So I think we have to look at the phases of this virus and look at how we can support this. In South Africa, the Department of Education does have a handbook for dealing with trauma, but it's a handbook and it is not, teachers are not professionals in this scenario. We can be taught to identify trauma and respond to it. But I think we're talking about a lot of depth in the need for psychosocial support. We've seen an incredible increase of abuse of children during this period. And the educational psychologists in South Africa are few and far between. If we look at educational psychology, counseling psychology, clinical psychology, universities here turn out about 12 students in a master program a year to keep the profession highly professional. But in times like this, we notice that the dearth of this need. Often in our education districts, there will be one educational psychologist for the whole district. So I would also call on the government to increase this psychosocial support by increasing and lending far more support to educational psychologists. If a pupil sees an educational psychologist outside of school, they are not able to claim that on medical aid. They live in a zone where they rely very heavily on schools employing them, and only really independent schools can employ them. So I think we need to work in a much more holistic fashion in terms of the support that we give children, as well as the teaching support. And I was just mindful that one of the things that Peter Ferris did, that he was acknowledged for in the Teacher Prize, was the Ring of Peace. And Peter, I would really think that it would be wonderful to start a Ring of Hope on WhatsApp at this time throughout the world, for teachers to share with their children, for children to contribute messages of hope. And let's start a Ring of Hope for children. We also have this extraordinary situation in South Africa of criminality, where in my province alone, 55 schools have been, during this 19-day lockdown period, have been looted. The school nutrition food has been taken, the desks, the printers, the computers. So that's 55 schools less when children go back to school at the end of this month. And I would call on our government to really deploy army to the schools to protect them, because we're talking about millions of rand to recover these schools. And we also have a huge problem in that we have government creating wonderful suggestions of responding to the poor and needy in our country, who we have over 10 million children receiving school meals, which they're not receiving at the moment. And government has said that it will deliver food parcels. Well, the early childhood education projects that we support have not received a parcel in these 19 days. So we have slow delivery of relatively good policy, and that needs to be stepped up big time. Those are just some of the issues I've raised.